Welcome back to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Today we are doing something a little different. Usually when we talk about security, we're talking about guns and missiles and treaties. But today I want to start by looking at a map. And not just a geographical map, but an architectural one. If you look at the security architecture of Europe post-World War II, you see a web. You see the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's this massive collective system.
Right. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's the core principle.
Exactly. It's a huge multilateral blanket.
That is really the gold standard of alliance theory. It's what we call collective defense. It's designed to be a force multiplier, where everyone contributes to the pot.
Right. But here is the puzzle that kicks off our deep dive today. If you spin that globe over to East Asia, and you're looking at the exact same time period, late 40s, early 50s, facing, the exact same enemy in communism, that web completely vanishes. There is no Asian NATO. Instead, what you see are these distinct separate lines, a line from the United States to Japan, a line from the United States to South Korea.
A line to the Philippines, to Taiwan.
It looks like a bicycle wheel.
The famous hub and spoke system.
That is the term. And that is the mystery we are unpacking today. Why did the United States, the architect of the post-war world, build this, this mansion in Europe, but then turn around and build a series of unconnected panic rooms in Asia?
Was it an accident?
Was it an accident? Was it culture? Or was it something much more calculated?
It's one of the great questions in international relations. And the answer, I think, is a little uncomfortable. It really challenges the good guy narrative of American diplomacy.
How so?
Well, we often think the hub and spoke system just sort of happened because Asia was too difficult or too diverse. But the reading list we have for today suggests it wasn't a default option. It was a deliberate design choice. And that choice was based on one thing: control.
And we have a massive stack of literature to get through today to really prove that point. We are looking at the origins, the economics, and the current cracking of this very system.
It's a big lift.
It is. So who are the heavy hitters we're citing today?
So we're anchoring the whole historical discussion with Victor Cha's seminal work, Power Play: Origins of the U.S. Alliance System in Asia. If you want to understand the why of all this, that is the text.
Okay, that's the foundation.
That's the foundation. Then, to understand the mechanics of how these alliances actually function today, specifically looking at the Republic of Korea, we have the U.S.-South Korea Alliance by Lee, Prinz, and Weigand.
And of course, we can't talk about Asia without talking about the dragon in the room.
You absolutely cannot. For that, we have China Engages Asia by David Shambaugh and a really, really counterintuitive paper by Bjorn Jordan and Linus Hagstrom called Rethinking Japan's China Policy. That one is going to upset a lot of the conventional wisdom you hear on the news.
Good. I like being upset.
Then we get into the real nuts and bolts of the economy with After the Trans-Pacific Partnership by Michael Green and Matthew Goodman. And finally, we look at the emotional and political friction between the allies themselves with Sheila Smith's intimate rivals.
Wow.
Plus, we have some data slides on global supply chains that I think will completely rewrite how you should think about trade deficits.
It's a heavy list, so let's jump straight into the deep end. Let's start with Victor Cha and Power Play.
Let's do it.
So the standard story I learned in school, or at least the one that feels intuitively correct, is that Europe got the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because they were culturally similar. They were all Western. They were mostly democracies. They had a shared history. Asia, on the other hand, was just a mess of different cultures, former colonies, developing nations. They just couldn't work together.
And that is the cultural essentialist argument. It basically says Europeans are good at cooperation, Asians are not. And frankly, it's lazy, and it's just wrong.
So Cha dismantles that.
He dismantles this pretty ruthlessly. He argues that the United States didn't fail to build a multilateral alliance in Asia because the Asians wouldn't agree to it. The United States didn't build it because the United States didn't want it.
That sounds bizarre.
Yeah.
Why would the U.S. not want a force multiplier? If you have a NATO in Asia, wouldn't that mean more troops, more money, and less burden on the American taxpayer? It seems like a no-brainer.
In theory, yes, absolutely. But Cha introduces a variable that overrides all of that efficiency, and that variable is control. We have to look at the agency of the United States here. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the U.S. planners were looking at their potential allies in East Asia. And we're talking specifically about Syngman Rhee in South Korea and Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, or the Republic of China.
Okay, so these were the anti-communist stalwarts, the good guys,
They
right?
were certainly anti-communist. But good guys kind of implies they were stable, peace-loving Democrats. They were not.
No.
They were fierce, aggressive nationalists. Syngman Rhee's entire political legitimacy, I mean, his whole reason for being, rested on the idea of reunifying the Korean peninsula.
By force.
By force, if necessary, yes. And Chiang Kai-shek was absolutely obsessed with retaking the mainland from Mao Zedong.
So they were both just itching for a fight.
They were obsessed with it, and this terrified Washington. This brings us to the absolute core concept of Chai's power play theory. The rogue ally, and the fear of entrapment.
Entrapment is usually something I associate with, undercover cops. What does it mean in international relations?
It's a great question. In alliance theory, entrapment is when your smaller, weaker ally picks a fight that then drags you, the larger ally, into a war you didn't want to fight.
Yeah.
So the U.S. looked at Syngman Rhee and they thought, okay, if we give this guy a NATO-style guarantee where an attack on him is automatically an attack on us, and then he decides to march north tomorrow morning to start a war,
we're stuck.
we are legally, morally, and militarily bound to jump into what would become World War III.
Because the Soviets and the Chinese had mutual defense treaties with North Korea.
Precisely. So a small skirmish started by Syngman Rhee in Korea could, very quickly escalate into a nuclear exchange between Washington and Moscow. And that is the absolute nightmare scenario for U.S. planners.
So what Cha is arguing is that the hub-and-spoke system wasn't designed just to protect the Asians from the communists.
No.
It was designed to protect the United States from the Asians.
That is the big cynical flip. It's a containment strategy, but you're not containing the enemy. You're containing your so-called friends.
Power play.
It is the power play. By keeping the alliances strictly bilateral one-on-one, the United States maximized its leverage.
How does that work? Why is bilateral better for control?
Well, think about it. If there was a multilateral council, like at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Rhee and Chiang could potentially get together. They could gang up, they could coordinate, they could try to outvote the U.S. diplomatically.
They could form their own bloc within the alliance.
Exactly. But in a bilateral system, Syngman Rhee only talks to Washington. Chiang Kai-shek only talks to Washington. They're completely isolated from each other. The spokes can't connect without going through the hub.
It creates this total dependency on the U.S.
It creates a leash. And Cha details the specific mechanics of this control, and it is fascinatingly petty. The U.S. didn't just use treaties, they used logistics. They controlled the fuel and the ammunition.
Wait, like literally rationing their gas?
Literally. There were periods where the United States would only provide the South Korean military with enough fuel and ammunition for just a few days of operations. It was a physical break on their ambitions.
So Rhee could give a big speech about marching to Pyongyang.
He could scream about marching north all he wanted, but his tanks would run dry long before they reached the Yalu River. The U.S. deliberately kept the Republic of Korea military completely dependent on American supply lines to ensure they could not conduct independent offensive operations.
That is an incredible level of micromanagement. It's not just, I've got your back, it's, I've got your car keys, and you can't go anywhere without my permission.
That's the perfect analogy. And that is why the bilateral structure was so essential. It allowed for that level of intrusive day-to-day control. A multilateral organization like NATO has committees, it has political councils, there are procedures. You can't just micromanage a coalition of, in theory, equals.
But you can absolutely dominate a dependent protege when you're the only other person in the room.
Absolutely.
So the logic is, we need to stop the spread of communism. That's the domino theory. But we also need to stop our own allies from being the ones who start the fire that burns the whole house down.
And the domino theory is actually a huge part of this, but maybe not in the way people usually think about it.
What do you mean?
It wasn't just the fear of an external invasion from China or the Soviet Union. The U.S. also feared that if a rogue ally like Rhee started a war and lost, or even if it just created chaos, the resulting economic collapse would make their regimes crumble from the inside out.
So internal stability was just as important.
It was everything. Stability was the goal. The status quo was the goal. And the hub and spoke system was effectively a straitjacket designed to freeze the lines on the map exactly where they were.
Okay, so that explains the 1950s. It makes a lot of sense. We need to put a halter on these aggressive authoritarian leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But Syngman Rhee has been dead for a very long time. South Korea is now a vibrant democracy. It's a global cultural powerhouse and economic giant. Taiwan is a high-tech democracy.
Right.
The rogue ally problem doesn't really seem to apply anymore. So why do we still have this system? Why does it persist?
And that is the perfect transition. That moves us to the work by Lee, Prinz, and Weigand on the patron-protege model. The relationship has evolved, for sure, but the fundamental structure of asymmetry remains.
And asymmetry just means one is big and one is small.
Essentially, yes. One provides security and the other consumes it. In this model, the U.S. is the patron and the Republic of Korea is the protege. But what Lee, Prinz, and Weigand argue is that we really need to look at the exchange of benefits. This is not charity from the United States.
Well, I can see what South Korea gets out of the deal. They get the nuclear umbrella. They get 28,500 American troops standing on the border, acting as a human tripwire. That has to be worth billions and billions of dollars.
It's worth more than money. It was the entire foundation of their modern history. The reading discusses the Han River miracle, South Korea's rapid industrialization from one of the poorest countries on earth to one of the wealthiest.
In just a couple of generations.
Exactly. And that miracle was only possible because they didn't have to spend, say, 50 or 60% of their gross domestic product on defense. Because the U.S. was underwriting their national security, they could pour all their resources into education, infrastructure, and technology. Samsung and Hyundai exist in large part because of the U.S. security guarantee.
Okay, so the protege gets security, which allows it to get rich. I get that. What does the patron get? Why does the U.S. taxpayer keep footing the bill for this?
Strategic access. This is the key term the authors use. Forward deployment. If you look at the map of Asia again, where are U.S. troops actually based? They're in Japan, which is an island chain, and they're in South Korea, which is on the mainland.
Right.
South Korea is the linchpin. It is the only significant foothold the United States has on the entire Asian continent.
It's basically a permanent beachhead.
A permanent beachhead. And this allows the U.S. to project power not just against North Korea, but it acts as a constant check on China and Russia. It puts the U.S. military right on the doorstep of its great power rivals. If that alliance were to end tomorrow and U.S. troops had to withdraw to Hawaii or Guam,
the whole U.S. position in Asia would collapse.
It would collapse backward across the Pacific.
Yeah.
The U.S. sphere of influence would shrink dramatically.
So we trade security for strategic real estate.
Strategic real estate and legitimacy. The reading makes a really strong point that being the hub validates the U.S. claim to global leadership. You can't really be a global superpower if you don't have a global network of allies. The alliance system proves that the U.S. is a Pacific power, not just an American one.
The reading also touched on public opinion, which I found surprisingly robust. We see the protests on the news, the anti-base movements, the environmental concerns about the military presence.
Of course.
But the data that Lee, Prinz, and Weigand present suggests that's really a vocal minority.
It is. The polling data they cite is really consistent. It shows that despite the transition from authoritarianism to democracy in South Korea, which was a very rocky period where the U.S. was often seen as supporting the dictators, by the way.
Right, that complicates things.
It complicates things immensely. But despite all that, the fundamental public support for the alliance is extremely high, over 90% in some surveys. And what's interesting is it's high in the U.S. too. Americans seem to understand at a gut level that having allies is better than going it alone, even if they sometimes complain about the cost.
So the hub and spoke system survived the Cold War. It survived the democratization of the spokes themselves. But now it faces a threat that Victor Cha's 1950s planners couldn't have fully predicted. The rise of a competitor that isn't just a military threat, but an economic necessity for the entire region.
Enter China.
So we have David Chambaw's China Engages Asia in our stack, and this paints a very, very different picture than the Soviet threat of the Cold War. The Soviets were, trying to overthrow governments, funding communist insurgencies. Chambaw suggests China is doing something much more subtle.
It's a completely different playbook. Chambaw documents this massive shift in Chinese strategy over the last few decades. It went from being a revolutionary power, literally funding insurgents in places like Malaysia and Thailand, to a status quo power that engages through institutions. He calls it the charm offensive.
Which sounds like a dating strategy, but I assume it's geopolitics.
It's highly effective geopolitics.
Yeah.
China realized that bullying its neighbors just pushed them closer to the United States. So they started opening their wallet. They started joining regional organizations they used to condemn. They established the Association of Southeast Asian Nations +3 Forum. They created this dense web of economic interdependence.
And this is the wedge, right? Because the hub and spoke system is fundamentally a security system. It doesn't really have an economic component anymore. So you get this really weird dynamic where countries in the region look to Washington for guns.
And to Beijing for butter.
Ex-
It's what some scholars call the dual hierarchy, and it's the defining dilemma of the region today. Shambo points out that China's goal isn't necessarily to invade these countries, but to make the U.S. alliance system irrelevant. If your entire economy is integrated with China, do you really need the U.S. Marines? Do you want to risk angering your biggest trading partner?
This brings us to what I thought was the most surprising paper in our stack today, the one by Jordan and Hagstrom on Japan.
Oh, yes.
Because if there's one country in the world I would expect to be immune to China's charm, it's Japan. They are historical rivals, they have nasty territorial disputes, they are the U.S.'s biggest and most important ally in the region. The textbook realist prediction would be that as China's power rises, Japan should be balancing against it hard.
Building nukes,
Yeah.
doubling their defense spending, actively trying to contain the threat.
Right. And that's not what happened.
That is what every realist scholar for 30 years predicted would happen. And Jordan and Hagstrom looked at the actual data from about 1978 to roughly 2011 and said, it just didn't happen.
They argued Japan accommodated China. That seems crazy.
It does, but they bring the receipts. They look at things like official development assistance, or ODA. For decades, Japan was the single largest provider of foreign aid to China. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. They helped to build the ports, the railways, the power plants that quite literally fueled China's economic rise.
Well, why on earth would they do that? Why would you fund the growth of your biggest strategic rival?
Because the logic of what we call liberalism won out over the logic of realism. The Japanese policymakers, and very importantly, the powerful business lobbies in Tokyo, believed that a wealthy, integrated China would eventually become a peaceful China. They thought if they helped China modernize, China would become what they called a responsible stakeholder in the international system.
The old idea that economic ties prevent war.
Exactly. The mantra in Tokyo for years was hot economics, cold politics. Even when political relations were in the freezer, like when Prime Minister Koizumi would visit the controversial Yasukuni Shrine and China would scream in protest.
The money kept flowing.
The Japanese ODA kept flowing. The Japanese factories kept opening in China. And Jordan and Hagstrom point out the most damning piece of evidence. Japan's military spending remained virtually flat, famously capped at 1% of its gross domestic product, during the exact period that China's military spending was exploding by double digits every single year.
That is not the behavior of a country that is balancing.
Not at all. That is the behavior of a country that is making a huge bet on commerce over conflict.
But that bet seems to be souring now, to put it mildly.
It is definitely being reassessed in Tokyo right now. But the fact remains that for decades, the hub and spoke system had this massive hole in it. The spokes, particularly Japan, were actively helping to build the rival. And now they are, in many ways, economically addicted to that rival.
And that addiction isn't just about selling cars or PlayStations. It's about the very nature of how things are made in the 21st century. We have this slide in the deck about the iPhone value chain, and I think this is absolutely crucial for understanding this economics as security discussion.
This slide, I think, is the antidote to every cable news segment you've ever seen about the trade deficit.
Okay, so let's break it down for the listener. We see a picture of an iPhone. On the back, it says assembled in China. When that phone arrives at a port in the U.S., the customs agent marks down the full factory value, let's say it's $179, as an import from China.
Right. So if we import 10 million of those phones, that's almost $2 billion added to the U.S.-China trade deficit. It makes it look like China is this massive economic vampire just sucking value out of the U.S. economy.
But the slide applies what's called value-added analysis. It asks a different question. Who actually made the components inside that phone?
And this is where the numbers get wild.
They really do. Japan, 34% of the value. Germany, 17%. South Korea, 13%. The United States itself, 6%. And China, the country where it was made,
3.6%.
That is just unbelievable. The country that gets 100% of the blame for the export on the trade balance sheet captures less than 4% of the actual value.
Because they're just doing the final low-wage assembly. They are screwing the Japanese screen to the Korean battery and the American processor. But here is the critical security implication. If the United States decides to start a trade war with China, or tries to decouple its economy, who gets hurt the most?
Not China, apparently.
Well, China gets hurt, but the real pain is felt by Japan and South Korea. our allies.
Spokes.
The spokes. You think you're striking at the Chinese assembly plants, but you're actually bleeding the Japanese and Korean high-tech component manufacturers. The supply chains are so deeply integrated that you cannot target the rival without causing massive collateral damage to your own allies.
Which explains why the economic piece of this architecture is so vital now. And this is where Green and Goodme's article after TPP comes in. They argue that trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership were never just about tariffs on cheese or cars.
No, not at all. They were about survival.
What do they mean by that?
The Trans-Pacific Partnership was intended to be the economic equivalent of NATO. It was, at its core, a rule-setting body. Green and Goodman emphasize that in the 21st century, security isn't just about borders and tanks. It's about intellectual property. It's about data flow, labor standards, and the behavior of state-owned enterprises.
And those are all the areas where China, cheats, right? Subsidizing their state-owned enterprises to undercut competitors, stealing intellectual property.
That's right. So the TPP was designed to write a set of high-standard rules of the road for the global economy. Rules that would essentially force China to either play fair or be excluded from a trading bloc that represented 40% of the global economy.
It was a strategic masterstroke, in theory. It would bind the U.S., Japan, Vietnam, Australia, all together economically.
It was, and then the U.S. walked away from it.
We just pulled the plug.
We pulled the plug. And Green and Goodman argued this was a catastrophic self-inflicted wound. By vacating the field, the United States essentially said to the region, we are not interested in writing the rules anymore.
So China gets to write them.
Exactly. China immediately pushed its own, much weaker trade deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which has much lower standards. No real labor protections, very weak IP rules. But beyond the rules themselves, the withdrawal from the TPP signaled to our allies that the U.S. is unreliable.
Credibility again.
It's always about credibility. The question in the minds of leaders in Tokyo and Seoul becomes, if the hub can't even commit to a trade deal that it designed, can the spokes really trust it to commit to a nuclear war over an island dispute?
That is a chilling thought. But if the hub is looking a little shaky, the spokes aren't exactly helping themselves, are they?
No, they are not.
We have one last segment to cover, and it's the one that I imagine drive American diplomats to drink. The relationship, or lack thereof, between Japan and South Korea.
The weakest link in the whole chain. Sheila Smith's book, Intimate Rivals, explores this just painful dynamic.
From the outside, it makes absolutely no sense. Japan and South Korea are both advanced democracies. They're both wealthy, capitalist economies. They both host U.S. troops. They both face existential threats from North Korea and a rising China. They should be best friends. There should be a trilateral lock with the U.S., but they really aren't.
They often seem to hate each other more than they fear their common enemies. And the reason is that in East Asia, history is not dead. It's not even past.
You're talking about the colonial period.
The period of Japanese colonization of Korea from 1910 to 1945 left these deep, deep scars that have not healed. We are talking about the comfort women issue, which was the systemic sexual slavery of tens of thousands of Korean women by the Imperial Japanese Army. We are talking about forced labor in Japanese mines and factories.
And these aren't just things in history books. They are active political volcanoes that erupt constantly.
Constantly. Sheila Smith details how these issues cycle over and over again. A South Korean court will issue a ruling that a Japanese company owes reparations for forced labor during the war. The Japanese government then claims all those debts were settled in the 1965 treaty that normalized relations. Then Japan retaliates with punitive export controls on key chemicals that Samsung needs to make semiconductor chips. Then the South Korean government threatens to cancel intelligence sharing agreements with Japan.
It's an absolute mess.
Right.
And Smith talks about the triangle dilemma for the United States. The U.S. needs its two most important allies to work together.
Desperately. Specifically for the North Korea problem. If North Korea launches a missile, the complex radar tracking relies on a seamless handoff between American and Japanese systems in Japan and American and South Korean systems in Korea. If those two militaries aren't talking to each other, or worse, if they are actively hostile toward each other, the shield has a massive gap in it.
And the reading also mentions Japan's own internal struggle with this idea of normalization. This is the whole Article 9 debate.
Right. Japan's constitution, which was written by the Americans after World War II, has an article, Article 9, that renounces war as an instrument of state policy. But as the neighborhood gets more dangerous, with China's military buildup and North Korea's nukes, many leaders in Tokyo want to change that. They want what they call collective self-defense.
They want to be a normal country that can fight alongside the U.S. if an ally is attacked.
Exactly, which the United States supports, right? We want Japan to carry more of the security load.
Of course. But South Korea.
South Korea hates it. When people in Seoul see Japan building helicopter carriers or talking about acquiring long-range strike capabilities, they don't see an ally getting stronger to help deter China. They see their former colonizer rearming. It triggers a deep historical fear.
So the stronger the U.S. tries to make the Japan spoke, the more it alienates the Korea spoke.
It becomes this zero-sum game of trust and historical grievance. And you can be sure that China and North Korea exploit this division ruthlessly. Every time there's a wedge driven between Seoul and Tokyo, Beijing just smiles.
This is a staggering amount of complexity.
Yeah.
I mean, we started this deep dive with the power play theory, the U.S. creating a system to control its own rogue allies and prevent World War III. We moved to the patron-protege deal, the U.S. trading security for strategic access. Then we saw how the economic reality, the iPhone supply chain, and the failed Trans-Pacific Partnership is completely scrambling that old map. And finally, the deep historical friction between the allies themselves is threatening to break the whole thing apart.
It really highlights that the hub-and-spoke system is, at its heart, an artifact. It was a brilliant piece of statecraft and architecture for 1951. It solved the very specific problems of Syngman Rhee and a devastated pacifist Japan. But we are trying to run a 2026 global supercomputer on a 1950s operating system, and the cracks are showing everywhere.
So let's bring this all back to the listener. Why does this matter? Why should the person driving to work right now care about the arcane architecture of Asian security?
Because this architecture is the invisible scaffolding of the modern world you live in. Asia is the engine of the global economy. The semiconductors in your car, the phone in your pocket, the clothes you're wearing, the stability of the global financial markets, it all rests on the fragile peace in East Asia. If the hub fails, or if the spokes snap, we aren't just talking about a regional conflict on the other side of the world.
We're talking about a global economic crisis.
We are talking about the immediate collapse of the global supply chain and, potentially, the first great power war in 80 years. It's that serious.
It certainly makes the stakes of those, what seem like boring diplomatic summits feel a lot higher.
It should. Every time you read a headline about North Korean missiles or trade wars with China or arguments between Japan and South Korea, you are seeing the mechanics of this 1950s architecture straining against 21st century realities.
Before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with a final provocation. We've read all the theory, we've seen the history. What is the one question that lingers for you after going through all this material?
I keep coming back to Victor Cha's power play theory. The whole system was designed to control the allies because they were weak, unstable, and frankly, dangerous.
Right.
But today, Japan and South Korea are two of the most advanced, stable, and genuinely peace-loving democracies on the entire planet. They aren't rogues anymore. They're pillars of the international order.
So the entire original logic for the system is gone.
It's gone. So here's the question. If the control function is now obsolete, why do we insist on maintaining a structure that was built for control? Are we holding on to the hub and spokes because it's still the best way to defend the region? Or are we holding on to it because the United States is fundamentally afraid of a world where it isn't the hub?
Wow.
If we let the spokes connect, if we encouraged an Asian NATO to form that didn't necessarily need the U.S. at the absolute center of every decision, would we celebrate that as a victory for democracy and self-reliance, or would we fear it as a loss of American power and influence?
That is a fascinating and deeply uncomfortable question. Are we the policemen because we have to be, or because we just want to be?
Exactly. And as the costs of being the hub continue to rise, that answer is going to matter more and more.
Well, thank you for guiding us through that incredibly dense stack of reading. This was a heavy one, but I feel like I can actually understand the news from Asia now.
That's always the goal. Thanks for having me.
And thank you to everyone listening. This has been the Doctrine Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.